In a quiet room in a museum in Berlin, behind glass, there is a face. It is the face of a woman who died some 3,300 years ago, and it is, quite possibly, the most recognizable face to come down to us from the ancient world. The long neck, the straight, calm gaze, the tall blue crown, flat across the top, unlike anything worn by any other queen of Egypt. The lips still faintly red with the paint an artist laid on them 33 centuries ago. Millions of people have stood before that face, and yet almost everything about the woman it belongs to is uncertain. We do not know where she came from. We do not know who her parents were. We do not know how she died or when or where her body lies. We do not even know with any certainty how her story ends. She rose to a height no Egyptian queen had ever reached before her, stood beside her husband as he tore down the religion of his ancestors and built a whole new city in the empty desert. And then, at the peak of it all, she simply vanishes from the record. Her name is Nefertiti, and tonight we are going to follow her life, slowly and fully, from the first faint traces of her in the stone to the silence that swallowed her at the end. Her name means, in the language of ancient Egypt, something close to "the beautiful one has come." A curious name when you sit with it. Not a name that says who she is, but a name that announces an arrival. The beautiful one has come. It is the kind of name that sounds like a proclamation, and it puzzled the earliest scholars, who read it, who wondered whether it meant she had come from somewhere else, from beyond the borders of Egypt, a foreign princess arriving in a strange land. That idea, as we will see, has largely fallen away, but the name remains. And it remains strange, and it hangs over her whole story like a question that was never answered. Where did she come from, this beautiful one who came? What we do know is that she stood at the very center of the strangest 20 years in all of Egyptian history. Her husband was the king we now call Akhenaten, and Akhenaten did something no pharaoh before him had ever dared. He turned away from the whole vast web of belief that had held Egypt together for well over 1,000 years. The countless figures the Egyptians revered, the great temples, the powerful priesthoods, and he declared that there was only one power worth worshipping, the disk of the sun itself, which they called the Aten. He closed the old temples, he abandoned the ancient capital, he marched his whole court out into a stretch of empty desert and built a brand new city there, from nothing, in the sand. And through all of it, in image after image, carved on wall after wall, there beside him stands his queen, Nefertiti. Not behind him as queens were shown, beside him, and sometimes, astonishingly, in his place. That is where the wonder of this story lives. For in the art of Amarna, the city they built, Nefertiti is shown doing things that no Egyptian queen had ever been shown doing. She is shown the same size as the king, which in Egyptian art was a statement about power, not about height. She is shown driving a chariot. She is shown offering worship alone, without her husband beside her. And on one carved block, now in a museum far from Egypt, she is shown standing over a bound and helpless enemy, raising a mace to strike, in a pose so ancient and so absolutely reserved for the king, that to see a queen in it is like a chord struck wrong in a familiar song. It is not supposed to be there, and yet there she is. By the end of tonight, you're going to understand who this woman was, as fully as the evidence allows, where she may have come from and why we cannot be sure. How she rose to a height no queen of Egypt had reached before her. What part she played in the great religious upheaval that shook the whole kingdom. What her life was like inside that strange, bright, doomed city in the desert. How many children she bore, and what became of them. And, at the last, how she disappears from history, in a silence so complete that scholars are still arguing about it 3,000 years later. You will understand what we know, and, just as importantly, you will understand what we do not know and why. Sit for a moment with how unusual that is. We are speaking of a woman who stood at the absolute summit of the most powerful kingdom on earth, whose image was carved on temple walls thousands of times, whose face was copied by the finest sculptors of her age, whose name was written in stone up and down the river. And yet we cannot say with confidence who her father was. We cannot say where she was born, or in what year, or how old she was when she married. We cannot say what she died of. We have no record of her funeral, no certain tomb, no body we can point to and say, with confidence, this was her. Almost every ordinary fact of her life, the kind of fact we take for granted about far less important people, has slipped away. What remains is the image and the puzzle and the strange incompleteness of it all. And that incompleteness is not entirely an accident of time. Some of it was done on purpose. That is the darker thread running underneath this story, and we will follow it carefully tonight because it changes how we read every gap and every silence. because there is something else about Nefertiti that makes her story unlike almost any other. She was not merely lost. She was erased. When the strange years of Amarna ended, when the old religion came flooding back and the new city was abandoned to the sand, the kings who followed set out deliberately to unmake what had been done. Her husband's name was hacked out of the stone. His monuments were pulled down, block by block, and the blocks were carted away and buried inside the walls of other buildings. And her name went with his. She was chiseled away, struck from the lists, deliberately forgotten. For more than 3,000 years, the world did not know she had ever existed. And then, one December day, a little over 100 years ago, a German excavator digging in the ruins of that abandoned desert city put his hand into the sandy rubble on the floor of a collapsed workshop and lifted out a painted head. It had been lying there, face down, in the dark, for 33 centuries. And with that single object, the woman who had been erased became, almost overnight, the most famous queen of the ancient world. There is a deep and quiet irony in that which we will sit with tonight. They tried to erase her, and she became unforgettable. There is one more thing worth saying before we begin, and it is about the kind of story this is. This is not a story with a tidy ending. Some ancient lives come down to us whole or nearly whole, with a beginning and a middle and a clear last chapter. Nefertiti's does not. Her story breaks off. It stops mid-sentence, somewhere in the 17 years of her husband's strange reign, and what happens after that is argued over to this day by serious scholars who look at the same evidence and reach opposite conclusions. So we will follow her as far as the evidence allows, and then, when the evidence runs out, we will say so plainly. And we will look honestly at the possibilities, rather than choosing one and pretending it is certain. The uncertainty is not a flaw in the story. The uncertainty is part of the story. It is, in a way, what she left us. So tonight, let us go back. Let the modern world fade away, the way the light fades from the water at the end of the day. Let the centuries roll back, past the Rome we know, past the Greece we know, past the long, slow slide of Egypt into its later ages, all the way back to the 14th century before our era, to a kingdom at the very height of its wealth and power, a kingdom about to be turned upside down by a king with a strange vision and the woman who stood at his side. Let us follow her life, from the first faint traces to the final silence, slowly and gently, through the whole of this long night. Before we begin, if you find ancient Egypt as fascinating as we do, take a moment to like the video or subscribe. It's a small thing, but it helps this channel reach more curious minds like yours. So settle in, get comfortable, and let's begin. To understand Nefertiti, we must first understand the Egypt into which she stepped, for it was not a poor or a struggling Egypt, not a kingdom in decline, not a land waiting to be rescued. It was the opposite. She arrived at what was very likely the richest, most powerful, most confident moment in the entire long history of the Egyptian state, and that matters enormously, because the upheaval that she and her husband unleashed was not born of desperation. It was born at the very summit of success. It is a strange thing to sit with, and worth sitting with slowly. So picture Egypt in the middle of the 14th century before our era. Picture the great river, the Nile, flowing north through the desert as it had flowed for uncounted ages, the thin ribbon of black earth on either side of it, rich and dark and fertile from the flood that came every year, and beyond that black earth, on both sides, the red desert stretching away to the horizon, empty and burning and silent. All of Egyptian life clung to that river. The fields, the villages, the towns, the temples, everything pressed close to the water, because away from the water there was nothing at all. Every year the river rose and spread across the fields, and left behind it a fresh layer of dark silt, and out of that silt came the grain, and out of the grain came the bread, and out of the bread came the kingdom. That was the rhythm of Egyptian life, older than memory, steady as a heartbeat, and on the strength of that rhythm, Egypt in this age had grown extraordinarily rich. Its armies had pushed north into the lands beyond its borders, and south deep into Nubia, where the gold came from. Tribute flowed into its treasuries from a dozen lands. Foreign kings wrote letters to the pharaoh, letters we still have, begging for Egyptian gold, complaining that not enough had been sent, marrying their daughters into the Egyptian court in hopes of favor. In Egypt, one of those letters says, "Gold is as common as dust." That was the reputation of the place. The king who ruled at the height of this splendor, the king who would be the father of Nefertiti's husband, was a man we call Amenhotep III, and he sat on a throne that was, by any measure, the most magnificent in the world. His reign was long and prosperous and largely peaceful. He built on a colossal scale. And when he died, his son inherited a kingdom overflowing with wealth, with power, and with confidence. Now hold that picture and add to it the other great pillar of Egyptian life: belief. The Egyptians of this age revered a vast and tangled multitude of figures, powers they understood to move through the world and through the sky and through the earth beneath their feet. There was the figure they called Amun, whose great temple stood at Karnak in the southern city of Thebes, and whose priesthood had grown over the centuries immensely powerful and immensely rich. There was the figure they revered as Osiris, who in their belief presided over the realm of the dead. There was the one they called Isis, and the one they called Horus, and the jackal-headed figure they called Anubis, and dozens upon dozens more, worshipped in temples up and down the river, each with its own priests, its own lands, its own income, its own hold on the imagination of the people. This was not a small thing at the edges of Egyptian life. This was the whole architecture of Egyptian life, the frame on which everything else was hung. The king himself was understood, in their belief, to be the living link between the people and those powers. His whole legitimacy rested on it. And of all those temples and all those priesthoods, the greatest by far was the one at Karnak, the temple of the figure they called Amun. Century after century, kings had poured wealth into it. Every victory brought new tribute, every campaign brought new lands granted to the temple, every generation added new courts, new pylons, new halls of columns, until it had grown into an immense complex of stone, one of the largest religious buildings ever raised by human hands. And with the wealth came power. The priests of that temple controlled vast estates and vast granaries and vast numbers of people. Some historians have argued that by this age they had grown so powerful that they were, in effect, a rival center of authority to the throne itself. That argument is debated, and we should be careful with it, for the evidence is not as clear as it is sometimes made to sound. But there is no doubt at all that the temple was enormously rich, enormously old, and enormously entrenched. It was the establishment, it was the way things had always been done. Into this world, at some point in the middle of that century, in a place we cannot name, on a day no one recorded, a girl was born whose name would come to mean the beautiful one has come. And here, at the very first step of her story, we run into the first great silence. We do not know who her parents were. We do not know where she was born. We do not know what her childhood was like. The records simply do not say. This is worth pausing on because it is so easy, standing in front of that famous painted face, to feel that we know her. We do not. We know her image. Her origins are a blank. What we have instead are clues, and they are frustratingly indirect. There is a man named A powerful courtier of this period, who held an elevated priestly title of the sort that some scholars believe was granted to a man whose daughter had married the king. And there is I's wife, a woman named Te, who bears the title Nurse of the Great Royal Wife, which is to say Nurse of Nefertiti. Put those two facts side by side and a picture begins to form. A as Nefertiti's father, Te as the woman who raised her but was perhaps not her mother. Perhaps a second wife who came into the household after Nefertiti's own mother had died. It fits. It would explain a great deal, including the extraordinary influence that I would go on to wield for decades afterward, right up to the point where, many years later, he would himself sit on the throne of Egypt as king. But, and this is the crucial point, no text anywhere says plainly that I was her father. No inscription states it. It is an inference, a piece of careful reasoning built on titles and proximity, and it is widely accepted, and it may well be right, but it is not proof. That is the honest position, and we should hold it honestly. There was, for a long time, another theory, and it was born from her name itself. The beautiful one has come. If she came, perhaps she came from outside. And so it was proposed that Nefertiti was a foreign princess, sent from the kingdom of Mitanni, far to the northeast, as a bride in one of those diplomatic marriages that the great kings of the age arranged with one another. There was even a candidate, a Mitanni princess, who is known to have been sent to Egypt in this very period. It is a romantic idea, and it has never entirely died. But most scholars now think it unlikely. Her name is Good Egyptian. Her sister, a woman named Mutbenret, appears at the Amarna court and appears Egyptian. And the she came from elsewhere. Reading of her name may simply be a misreading of a formula that was not meant so literally at all. So the weight of opinion now falls on an Egyptian birth, and very probably a birth into the highest circles of the Egyptian court. But we do not know. Let us be clear about that as we go. At the very foundation of her story, there is a gap. What we can say is that she appears when she first appears at all, already at the summit. She does not climb into view slowly. She arrives already beside the king, The king was the son of Amenhotep III, and he came to the throne under his father's name as Amenhotep IV. In the earliest images we have of him, in tombs at Thebes belonging to men who served him, a royal woman stands with him, and that woman is thought to be Nefertiti. In the tomb of a royal butler, the new king appears with a royal woman at his side, the two of them worshipping the sun disk. In the tomb of a vizier, a very great official, she stands behind the king at the window where the pharaoh appeared before the court to shower rewards on his favorites. These are our first glimpses of her, faint and partial, a figure at the edge of scenes that are really about someone else. She was most likely very young, and she had married a man who was about to do something that no one in the long history of Egypt had ever done. It began quietly enough. Kings had honored the sun before. The disk of the sun, the Aten, was not an invention of Akhenaten. It had been part of Egyptian belief for generations, one power among many, gathering a little prominence in the reign of his father. But the young king's devotion to it deepened and hardened and began to take a shape that must have alarmed the men around him. In the very first years of his reign, he began raising temples to the Aten at Karnak itself, right there in the shadow of the great temple of Amun, on ground that belonged, in every sense that mattered, to the old order. And these were not modest chapels. They were vast open structures, roofless, built to let the light of the sun fall directly onto the altars, unlike the dark, enclosed, secretive sanctuaries of the older temples, where the sacred image sat in shadow, and only the priests could go. The whole architecture was a statement. The old worship happened in the dark, behind walls, mediated by priests. The new worship happened in the open, under the sky, in the light, in full view. And on the walls of those new temples at Karnak, something extraordinary appears. Nefertiti, not as an accessory, not as a decorative consort standing small at her husband's knee, but as a central figure, carved again and again, in scene after scene. In one of those temple structures, she appears to have been the dominant figure, the one performing the offerings. She is shown worshipping the sun disk herself, and she is shown on some of these blocks in poses that had belonged for 1,000 years and more to the king and to the king alone, smiting a captive, standing in the pose of triumph. This is the first hint, and it comes very early, that whatever was happening between this king and this queen was not the ordinary arrangement of pharaoh and consort. Something else was going on. We should be careful here, because it is easy to leap ahead of the evidence and turn Nefertiti into the secret architect of everything, the true power behind the throne, the woman who was really running Egypt. Some popular accounts do exactly that. The honest answer is that we cannot tell. What the images prove is prominence, unprecedented prominence, a queen given a place in the sacred imagery of the state that no queen had held before. What they cannot prove is intention, or authorship, or who was persuading whom in the private rooms of the palace. We can see that she was elevated. We cannot see who did the elevating, or why. And that gap between what the stone shows and what we would love to know is a gap we will meet again and again tonight. Then, in the 4th year of his reign, the king made his decision. He would leave. He would abandon Thebes, the great southern capital, with its temples and its priesthoods and its centuries of accumulated tradition, and he would go out into the desert and build a new city on virgin ground. Ground that belonged to no old power, that had never been consecrated to any of the figures his ancestors had revered. Ground that was clean. He found his site in Middle Egypt, on the east bank of the river, a wide bay of desert enclosed by a great semicircle of cliffs, empty, unused, unclaimed. And there he set up boundary markers, great inscribed stela, cut into the rock, declaring the limits of his new capital and swearing that he would never go beyond them. He named the place Akhetaten, which means something like the horizon of the Aten, the place where the sun disk rises. Today we call it Amarna, and in the 5th year of his reign, he changed his own name. He was no longer Amenhotep, a name that carried within it the name of the old figure Amun. He became Akhenaten. And Nefertiti's name changed too, lengthened, deepened, bound to the new worship. Neferuaten Nefertiti, which carries the sense of beautiful are the beauties of the Aten. The beautiful one has come. Their names were now statements of faith. They had, in the most literal sense available to them, rewritten themselves. The names they had been given at birth were set aside, and new names were taken up, names that were arguments, names that declared a faith. So picture it now, the court packing up, the scribes and the officials and the soldiers and the servants and the craftsmen, the whole apparatus of the greatest kingdom on earth, loading onto boats, sailing downriver, and disembarking on an empty desert shore, where there was nothing at all. No city, no temples, no houses. Nothing but sand and rock and the cliffs standing back in a great half-circle, and the river running past, and the enormous silence of a place where no one had ever lived, and the king standing on that shore with his young queen beside him saying, "Here, we build here." They built it in something like a decade. Palaces, vast open sun temples, broad ceremonial roads, storehouses, workshops, villas for the great officials, cramped districts for the workers, a whole functioning capital raised out of nothing on the edge of the desert. And into it moved the royal family, and the court, and the government of Egypt. It was one of the most extraordinary acts of will in the entire ancient world, and it is worth pausing here, in the quiet, to feel the sheer strangeness of it properly, because we have grown so used to hearing the story told quickly that the strangeness wears off, and we stop noticing it at all. A king at the height of his power, ruling the richest kingdom on earth, walked away from his own capital and built another one in the desert because of what he believed about the sun. And when we look at what they carved on the walls of that new city, we find something we do not find anywhere else in the whole of Egyptian art. We find them, not stiff, not eternal, not frozen in the timeless poses that Egyptian kings had held for 1,000 years, but the king and the queen together, and their daughters climbing on them. A scene where Nefertiti holds a child on her lap, a scene where a small daughter reaches up to touch her mother's chin, a scene of the king lifting a girl to kiss her, the sun disk above them, its long rays reaching down, each ray ending in a small human hand, and those hands holding out the sign of life to the king and the queen and to no one else. It is intimate in a way that Egyptian royal art simply is not. It is warm. And it is, at the same time, absolutely a piece of theology, because what it says, underneath the tenderness, is that the light reaches the royal family directly, and everyone else must reach it through them. Let us stay a moment longer with that city, because it is the stage on which the rest of her life is played out, and it helps to see it clearly. Amarna was not a normal Egyptian city that grew slowly over generations, layer upon layer, the way Thebes had grown, the way Memphis had grown. It was planned and raised in a single push, on empty ground, and it shows. Down the middle of it ran a great processional road, wide and straight, and along that road the king and the queen would ride out each morning in their chariots, from the palaces at the north, down through the heart of the city, in what seems to have been a daily ritual of appearance, the royal couple moving through their capital under the light of the sun disk as the whole population watched. Imagine that. Not a rare festival, not a once-a-year procession, but a regular, repeated performance of royalty in motion, the chariots and the horses and the running guards and the dust rising in the morning light, and the queen driving her own chariot, which is itself a startling image, and one the artist chose to carve. And around that ceremonial spine lay the rest of it. The great temple to the sun disk, open to the sky, its courts filled with hundreds upon hundreds of offering tables laid out in rows, so that the light could fall directly onto every one of them. The palaces, with their painted floors, on which artists had laid out pools and reeds and birds taking flight, so that the royal family walked, quite literally, across a painted marsh. The workshops of the sculptors, where the finest craftsmen of the age were producing images of the royal family in a style that had never been seen before. The houses of the great officials, spacious and walled, and out on the edges, the cramped, packed quarters of the workers who built it all, and beyond them, cut into the cliffs, the tombs where the officials of the new order hoped to be buried, their walls carved with scenes not of the ancient beliefs their fathers had held, but of the king and the queen and the sun disk, over and over again. That last detail is worth holding on to. In the tombs of the Amarna officials, the great men of the new city, the scenes on the walls are not really about the men buried in them at all. They are about the royal family. A man's tomb, the place meant to secure his passage into whatever came after death, was filled with images of the king and the queen and their daughters. Because in this new arrangement, the way to that other world no longer ran through the old figures and the old rituals. It ran through the king and through the queen. Nefertiti was not merely a prominent consort in this system. She was built into its structure. Remove her, and the whole thing does not stand. That is the world she stepped into and helped to make. A kingdom at the peak of its wealth. A king with a vision that would break the whole shape of Egyptian belief. A new city rising out of empty sand. And a queen who, for reasons we still cannot fully explain, was lifted to a height that no queen of Egypt had ever occupied before. And one more thing, which we will need later. Everything we have just described, the city, the temples, the tombs, the painted floors, the daily chariot rides, the whole vast apparatus of a new capital and a new belief, All of it depended on one man's conviction and one man's life. It had no roots. It had no centuries behind it. No deep hold on the villages up and down the river. No army of priests with land and grain and generations of habit to defend it. It was, for all its scale and all its beauty, a very thin thing, held up by the will of a king and the presence of his queen, and thin things, when the wind changes, do not last. That is the shadow lying over every bright scene we are about to walk through, and it is worth carrying with us as we go. Now let us go inside that city and follow her life within it, year by year, as closely as the stones allow. So here we are, inside the city. The sun is up over the eastern cliffs, and the light is falling on a capital that did not exist a decade ago. Let us follow Nefertiti through it, and through the years of her life within it, from the height of her power to the moment the record breaks. This is the heart of our night, and we will take it slowly, in several parts, so that a listener drifting in and out can find their way back in whenever they surface. Let us begin with the daughters, because they are everywhere in the art of Amarna, and because they are, in a sense, the shape of her life. Nefertiti bore 6 daughters, 6 that we know of. Their names, in the order they seem to have come, were Meritaten, Meketaten, Ankesenpaten, Neferneferaten the younger, Neferneferar, and Setapenre. The first 3 were born in the years at Thebes, before the great move. The last 3 were born in the new city in the desert. 6 girls born across roughly a decade. And no son. That fact, the absence of a son, sits quietly under everything that follows, and we will come back to it more than once tonight, because in a kingdom where the throne passed from father to son, the absence of a son is not a private sorrow. It is a political fact, and eventually it becomes a crisis. But before it was a crisis, it was a family, and the art shows us that family in a way no Egyptian art had ever shown a royal family before. Picture the scenes carved on the walls. The king and the queen seated facing one another, and the daughters swarming over them, climbing, reaching, being held. A small girl standing on her mother's lap, one hand up at her mother's chin. Another daughter perched on her father's knee as he leans forward to kiss her. The queen with a child on her shoulder. Above them all, the disk of the sun and the long straight rays coming down, each one ending in a tiny human hand, and those hands offering the sign of life directly to the king and to the queen. It is warm, and it is intimate. And it is also, if you look at it steadily, a piece of very careful argument. The light reaches them. It reaches no one else. Everyone else in Egypt must reach the light through them. And in these family scenes, Nefertiti is not a decorative presence. She is structurally essential. In the theology that seems to have been built at Amarna, there was a triad, a group of 3, the sun disk, the king, and the queen. Take any one of the 3 away and the arrangement collapses. The disk gives life to the king and the queen. The king and the queen give life to Egypt. Nefertiti was not standing beside the system. She was inside it, one of its 3 load-bearing pillars. No queen of Egypt had ever occupied a position like that. Let us go further into what the images show, because the further you go, the stranger it gets. In ordinary Egyptian art, scale means status. The king is large, everyone else is smaller. It is a rule so consistent across so many centuries that when it is broken, the break is deliberate, and it means something. At Amarna, Nefertiti is repeatedly shown the same size as the king. Not slightly smaller, the same. She stands at his shoulder, matched to him, and in some scenes the 2 figures are so alike in face and in style that scholars have genuinely struggled on damaged blocks to tell which one is which. Think about what that means in a visual language where size is a statement about power. Someone made a decision, deliberately, repeatedly, across many monuments, to show the queen as the king's equal in the one code that everyone in Egypt could read at a glance. And then there are the scenes that go past equality altogether. She is shown driving a chariot, reins in her hands, which was a royal image, an image of command and of motion, and of mastery. She is shown offering worship to the sun disk alone, without her husband present, performing rites that were the king's to perform. She wears kingly emblems. In some images she wears the rearing cobra at her brow, the emblem of royal authority. She wears crowns. And there is one crown in particular, that tall, flat-topped blue crown that the whole world now knows from the painted bust. And here is the thing about it. It is hers. No other queen wears it. It is not a traditional queen's headdress at all. It is closer, in its shape and its bearing, to the war crown of a king. She is wearing something that had no precedent, and it was made for her. And then there is the block from a temple at Amarna, now far from Egypt, in a museum across the ocean, and it is the one that stops scholars in their tracks. It shows a royal figure on the deck of a boat, standing over a bound and kneeling captive, one arm raised, mace lifted, about to bring it down. This is the single oldest and most sacred image in the whole Egyptian visual vocabulary. It is the pose of the king, destroying the enemies of Egypt, holding back chaos, defending order. It goes back to the very beginning, to the first kings, thousands of years before. It belongs to the pharaoh. It is not shared. And the figure raising the mace in the tall crown is Nefertiti, and it gets stranger. Because for a long time scholars assumed this had to be a misidentification, that no one would carve a queen in that pose. But the figure is labeled, and the crown is hers, and the identification holds. So we are left with a fact that has to be explained rather than explained away. At some point during these years, Nefertiti was shown performing the most exclusively kingly act in Egyptian art, and nobody can tell us, with certainty, what that means. Was it a statement about her real authority, that she genuinely held power on a level with her husband? Was it theological, a way of expressing her place in the sacred triad? Was it a step in a long, deliberate preparation for something that was still to come? A slow raising of her status towards something more than queenship? Egyptologists have argued for all three. The stone gives us the picture. It does not give us the reason. Let us pause here and gather the thread. For anyone drifting, Nefertiti bore 6 daughters and no son. She was built into the very structure of the new belief, one of 3 pillars alongside the sun disk and the king. And in the art of the new capital, she was shown at the king's own scale, in the king's own crowns, driving chariots, worshipping alone, and even raising the mace over a captive in the most sacred kingly pose there is. Whatever she was not an ordinary queen. Hold that, and we will go on. Now let us talk about what daily life in that city may have been like, as far as we can reconstruct it, because it is easy to lose the human being inside all this theology and all these carved statements of power. She lived in palaces. The floors were painted with marshes and pools and birds. There were gardens and pools and shaded courts, and the enormous heat of Middle Egypt pressing down on everything from mid-morning onward, and the cool coming suddenly at dusk. There was a whole royal household, nurses for the daughters, and among them we think a woman named Tay, the wife of the courtier Ai, the same woman who bore the title Nurse of the Great Royal Wife, which is to say she had raised Nefertiti herself, and now, it seems, remained close to her still, in the household of the queen she had raised. There was Nefertiti's sister, Mutbenret, who appears in the tombs of the officials, at ceremonies, in the queen's train. So there were people around her whom she had known all her life. Whatever else the desert city was, for her it also contained her own household, her own sister, the woman who had raised her, and her 6 girls. And there was ritual, endless ritual. The great open temple with its hundreds of offering tables ranged in rows under the open sky, the daily offerings. The chariot ride down the great road, out from the palace and through the city and back, the royal couple appearing before their people in motion, over and over, as a kind of living liturgy. The appearances at the window where the king and the queen leaned out together and showered gold collars down onto favored officials while the crowd roared beneath. Her life, as far as we can see it, was an unending public performance of the new belief, and she was at the center of every scene. But now we come to the year that changes everything, and the shape of the story begins to darken. In the 12th year of Akhenaten's reign, there is a great event, recorded in the tombs of the officials, and it is the last moment of unambiguous, glittering triumph in the whole Amarna story. It is a grand reception, a durbar, an enormous ceremony in which tribute is brought to the king and queen from across the empire and beyond. Foreigners bow. Gold is heaped. The royal family sits enthroned together. All of them, the king, Nefertiti, and the 6 daughters, receiving the wealth of the world. It is, as far as we can tell, the high watermark of the whole Amarna adventure. Everything is in place, everything is working. The city is built, the family is whole, the empire is paying. And then, almost immediately afterward, it all begins to come apart. Because within a very short time of that ceremony, the daughters start to disappear from the record. Meketaten, the 2nd daughter, dies. We know this, and we know it in a way that is almost unbearable to look at, because the moment is carved on a wall. In the royal tomb cut into the cliffs, in a chamber prepared for her, there is a scene of mourning. The king and the queen stand over the body of their dead daughter, and the artist has shown them in grief, bent, stricken, their hands raised. There is nothing else like it in Egyptian royal art. Egyptian kings were not shown grieving. Kings were shown triumphant, eternal, unmoved. And here are the king and the queen of Egypt, carved into the rock of their own tomb, in the raw posture of a mother and a father standing over a dead child. She was perhaps 10 or 11 years old, and it does not stop there. Other daughters vanish from the record around this same period, And the simplest explanation for a child who is named repeatedly and then never named again is that she died. 3 of the 6 seem to disappear in these years. What was killing them? We do not know. Some scholars have wondered about disease, a plague passing through the crowded city or through the region, and there are hints, in letters from other kingdoms of this period, that some kind of sickness was moving through the lands of the Near East in these very decades. It is a suggestion, not a proof, but something was carrying off the children of the royal house. And then, in the middle of this darkness, Nefertiti herself goes quiet. Here we arrive at the great silence, and we must walk into it very carefully, because this is the place where the story of Nefertiti stops being a story and becomes an argument. Somewhere after the 12th year, her name and her image begin to thin out of the record. She had been everywhere, on every wall, in every scene, her name carved thousands of times. And then, gradually, she is not. Other royal women appear at the king's side in some later scenes. First Meriteten, the eldest daughter, and later others. And Nefertiti, who had been the most visible queen in the history of Egypt, is simply no longer there. For a long time, scholars believed the explanation was straightforward. She died, somewhere around the 14th year, and that was that. It is the simplest reading of a person who is present and then absent, and for a long time it was the standard view. But it does not sit easily, and here is why. When a great royal wife of Egypt died, there were consequences that left traces, there were funerary preparations, there was a burial, there were objects. And for Nefertiti, we have almost nothing. There are a few fragments of the small funerary figures that were placed in Egyptian burials, fragments that carry her name, and which suggest that at some point a burial for her was being prepared. But there is no tomb we can point to and say, she was laid here. There is no body. There is no record of her funeral. For the most photographed face of the ancient world, the moment of her death is a blank. And so, over the last several decades, other explanations have come forward, and they are serious, and they are argued by serious people, and they cannot be waved away. The first is the fall from favor theory, which was popular once. The idea was that Nefertiti had been disgraced, cast aside, banished to a palace at the north end of the city, perhaps because of some rift in the royal family, perhaps a religious quarrel. It made for a dramatic story. And it has now largely collapsed, and it is worth understanding why, because the collapse teaches us something about how this kind of history is done. The theory rested partly on the observation that at a certain site, the name of a queen had been deliberately hacked out and replaced. Someone had been erased, and it was assumed that the erased queen must be Nefertiti in disgrace. But careful later work on those very inscriptions showed that the erased queen was not Nefertiti at all. It was another royal woman of Akhenaten's household, a woman named Kia, who had held a special title of her own, and who does seem to have been removed from the record. The evidence for Nefertiti's disgrace turned out to be evidence about somebody else, and so the theory fell. The second explanation is the plain one, and it may still be the right one. She died, perhaps in the same wave of death that took her daughters, perhaps of some ordinary illness, perhaps in childbirth. People died. Queens died. And the absence of her burial may mean nothing more than that the burial was disturbed or robbed or moved, or that it lies somewhere we have not yet dug. Egypt is very good at hiding things, and it has been hiding them for a long time, and the sand is patient. Absence of evidence, as scholars are fond of saying, is not evidence of absence. It may simply be that we have not yet looked in the right place, or that the right place was emptied long ago by robbers, whose names we will never know, working by lamplight in a tomb that had not been sealed for very long. And the third explanation is the one that has electrified the field, and it is this, that she did not vanish at all, but was promoted, that in the last years of Akhenaten's reign, she was raised from queen to co-ruler, given a throne name of her own, shown as a king because she had become one. That the reason Nefertiti disappears from the record is that Nefertiti, under that name, no longer exists, and the person we are looking for is standing right in front of us, under another name entirely. There is a shadowy figure who appears in exactly these years, a ruler bearing a name built from the very words of her own extended name, a ruler whose sex is not always easy to read in the inscriptions. And a growing number of scholars have looked at that figure, and looked at Nefertiti, and asked the obvious question, are these the same woman? We're going to take that question up properly later tonight, and we are going to look hard at what supports it and what does not. But notice for now how it changes the shape of everything we have just walked through. Because if that reading is right, then all those strange images we looked at earlier stop being strange. The equal scale, the kingly crowns, the chariot, the worship performed alone, the mace raised over the captive. None of it is decoration, and none of it is theology only. All of it is preparation. A long, patient, deliberate raising of a queen toward a throne, carried out in stone over years in full public view. And it gets stranger still, because we cannot tell whether we are looking at a plan or reading one into the past. That is the honest trouble with this whole period. The evidence is fragmentary, the monuments were smashed, the names were hacked out, and into every gap the modern imagination rushes. It is very easy, with a story this dramatic, to build a beautiful theory and then find the evidence that supports it. Good scholars know this and are wary of it. We should be wary too. Now, before we leave this section, there is one more piece of evidence, and it is a strange and important one, because it moves the ground under an older certainty. Not long ago, an inscription was noticed in a limestone quarry a little way north of the city, cut into the rock by workmen. It is not grand. It is a builder's note, the kind of thing scratched by people doing a job, and it carries a date, the 16th year of the king's reign, and it names, alive and in her titles, the great royal wife Nefertiti. Sit with that for a moment. For decades, the consensus had been that Nefertiti disappeared around the 14th year, that she was dead or gone before the end. And here is a workman's inscription from the 16th year, from the second to last year of Akhenaten's reign, naming her as the great royal wife, still alive, still in that title, right up near the end of his life. She did not vanish in the 12th year. She did not vanish in the 14th. She was there at the very close, still queen. And that single, scratched, unglamorous inscription does two things at once, which is why matters so much. It demolishes the older story of an early death or an early disgrace. And it complicates the newer story too, because it shows her still holding the title of great royal wife in the 16th year, which means that if she was ever raised to be a king, the raising must have happened very late indeed, in the last months, or after her husband was already dead. The ground shifts, and the argument goes on, and it will go on, and it is worth remembering in the quiet of the night that a scratch on a quarry wall, made by a working man who had no idea anyone would ever read it, has overturned a scholarly consensus that stood for the better part of a century. That is how this kind of knowledge moves, slowly and then all at once, and always at the mercy of what happens to survive. So let us gather this section together before we widen out. Nefertiti bore 6 daughters and no son. She was placed at the very heart of the new belief, one of 3 pillars. She was shown as no queen had ever been shown, equal in scale, crowned in crowns that were hers alone, driving chariots, worshipping alone, raising the mace over a captive. She stood at the summit at the great reception in the 12th year, with her husband and her 6 girls around her, and then the deaths began, and the daughters started to vanish, and the mourning was carved into the wall of a tomb, and Nefertiti herself began to fade from the record, and the record, in the end, simply stops, leaving behind an argument that has now run for a century and shows no sign of ending. But before we do, let us go back and dwell on some of the parts of her life that we passed over quickly, because there is far more to say, and the night is long, and these details deserve to be sat with, rather than hurried through. Let us go back, first, to the crown, because it is the object that made her famous, and we have not really looked at it. That tall blue crown, flat across the top, wider at the top than at the base, is not a headdress that any other Egyptian queen wears. It has no long tradition behind it. It appears with her, and it belongs to her, and when it appears in a damaged relief, scholars use it to identify her. Now, Egyptian crowns were not fashion. Every crown meant something. There was a crown for the north and a crown for the south and a crown that combined them. There was a crown worn in war. There were headdresses that marked out particular roles and particular powers. To wear a crown in Egypt was to make a claim about who you were and what you held. And so the question that hangs over Nefertiti's crown is simple and enormous. What claim was it making? It is not a queen's crown because no queen had worn it. It is closest in shape and in bearing to the crowns of kings. Someone designed it, deliberately, for her, and gave it a form that had never existed, and put it on her head, and had it carved onto walls throughout the kingdom, thousands of times. That is not an accident. That is a statement, and we still do not know exactly what it was saying. Let us go back to the daughters, one at a time, because they are not a list. They were children, and each of them has a small, sad story that can be pieced together out of the stones. Meritaten was the eldest, born in the years at Thebes, before the great move, before the new city, before the new names. She is the daughter who appears most often, and she is the one who lived longest in the record. As the years passed and her mother faded from the walls, it is Nefertiti who appears at the king's side in some of the later scenes, taking the place a queen would take. She would go on to be named a great royal wife herself, to a shadowy king who appears at the very end of the Amarna period. She survived, at least for a while, into the wreckage. Nefertiti was the second, and hers is the death we can see. The scene of mourning in the royal tomb, the king and the queen bowed over her body, is one of the most extraordinary images in Egyptian art, precisely because it shows what Egyptian art was not supposed to show, a royal family broken open by grief. There is even a detail in that tomb chamber, in one of the scenes, of a nurse carrying an infant away from the death chamber, which has led some scholars to wonder whether Nefertiti died in childbirth, which would be a horror piled on a horror, since she was perhaps 10 or 11 years old. That reading is disputed, and other scholars argue the infant is symbolic, a sign of rebirth rather than a literal baby. We cannot settle it. But either way, the wall shows us a mother and a father standing over a dead child, and that much, at least, is not in doubt. Nefertiti was the third, and she is the one whose life reaches furthest forward into a story you already know. She would survive the collapse. She would change her name when the old belief came back, dropping the sun disk from it and taking up the name of the old figure Amun instead, becoming Ankhesenamun. And she would marry the boy king Tutankhamun, and be his queen, and stand beside him through his short reign, and be widowed while she was still young. There is a famous, desperate letter from an Egyptian queen of about this period, written to a foreign king, begging him to send one of his sons to marry her because, she says, she has no one, and she will not marry a servant. Many scholars believe that Queen was Ankhesenamun, Nefertiti's third daughter, alone at the end of everything, writing to a foreign court for rescue. If that is so, then a daughter of Nefertiti was the last thread of that family, and it snapped. And then there are the three youngest Neferneferuaten, the younger Neferneferure and Setapenre, born in the new city, under the new sun. They appear in the family scenes, small figures among their sisters, and then they stop appearing. No death scenes, no burials we can identify. They simply cease, in the years after the Great Reception, and the silence is the only record we have of what happened to them. Not one of the 6 daughters of Nefertiti has ever been found. Not a body among them. Let us sit with that. 6 daughters, born to the most visible woman in the ancient world, in the wealthiest kingdom on earth, at the height of its power. And of those 6, no mummy has ever been identified with certainty. The mother is missing. Every one of the daughters is missing. The whole family has slipped through our fingers, and that is not ordinary. Egypt kept its dead. Egypt was better at keeping its dead than any civilization that has ever existed. And this family, the most powerful family in the world, the family whose faces were carved on 10,000 walls, is simply gone, scattered somewhere in the sand and the dark. Now let us go back to the other side of her life, the side that had nothing to do with children, and dwell on her power, because we passed over something important. We have talked about how she was shown, but what did she actually do? That is the hardest question in this whole story, and it is worth being honest about how hard it is. Egyptian monuments do not record decisions, they record claims. A wall showing the queen worshipping alone tells us that someone wanted her shown worshipping alone. It does not tell us whether she chose the policy, or advised on it, or merely stood where she was placed. We have no letters from her. We have no record of her speaking. We have no account by anyone who knew her. Everything we have is official, monumental, and carved by people working for the crown. Trying to reach the woman through that is like trying to hear a voice through a wall of stone. And yet there are things the stone does tell us, if we are careful. It tells us that she held religious office in the new belief in a way that was not decorative. In one of the temple structures at Karnak, in the earliest years, she appears to have been the principal figure, performing the offerings herself. That is not a wife standing politely behind her husband. That is a person carrying out the central act of a state religion. It tells us she was given titles of extraordinary weight, strings of them, praising not just her beauty but her voice, her presence, her power to soothe and to please. And more tellingly, titles that place her over the 2 lands, north and south, the whole kingdom. And it tells us, through the sheer relentless repetition of her image, that whoever was directing the message of the Amarna state wanted Egypt to see this woman constantly, in a way Egypt had never been asked to see a queen before. So we can say with reasonable confidence that she was central. We can say she held real religious function. We can say she was elevated, deliberately and repeatedly, toward the status of a king. What we cannot say is whether she was the engine of the revolution or its most brilliant ornament. whether she pushed her husband or followed him, whether she believed in the sun disk with all her heart, or simply performed the belief flawlessly for 20 years. The wall is silent on all of it. Anyone who tells you otherwise, with confidence, in either direction, is filling that silence with their own voice and mistaking the echo for evidence. And now let us go back once more to the atmosphere of those final years, because the mood of the story changes, and it changes for reasons that were not only personal. While the royal family was building its bright city and carving its intimate scenes, the empire outside was fraying. We know this because of a remarkable accident of survival. A cache of clay tablets found at Amarna itself, the diplomatic correspondence of the Egyptian court, letters from foreign kings and from Egypt's own vassal rulers in the lands to the north. And what those letters say over and over is, help. Enemies are pressing, cities are falling, send troops, send gold. Why do you not answer? There is a note of rising panic in some of them, and a note of complaint in others, and running underneath is the sense of an imperial power that has stopped paying attention. Now, we must be careful here too, because it is a very old and very tempting story to say that Akhenaten was so lost in his sun disk that he let the empire rot, and that Nefertiti stood beside him while it happened. Some historians have argued exactly that. Others push back hard, pointing out that vassal rulers always exaggerated their troubles to get help, that Egyptian control in those regions was never as total as the rhetoric suggested, and that we do not actually see the empire collapsing in this period so much as we see it under the ordinary strain it was always under. The truth is probably somewhere between. But the letters are there, and the tone of them is there, and they give the last years of Amarna an atmosphere of a household absorbed in itself, while the roof beams creak. Add the deaths. Add the dead daughters, one after another, the mourning scene in the rock. Add whatever sickness was passing through, and you have a court that began in blazing confidence and ended in something much darker. An aging king, a shrinking family, a city built on one man's conviction, an empire writing letters that no one answered, and a queen who, somewhere in all of this, stops being visible. Let us pause once more and gather the thread, softly, for anyone who has drifted. 6 daughters, 3 of whom vanish from the record in the space of a few years. A queen shown as no queen had been shown before, equal in size to the king, crowned in her own crown, driving a chariot, worshipping alone, raising the mace. A great reception in the 12th year, the last bright moment, then death after death, and grief carved into a tomb wall. Then the queen herself begins to fade, and then a workman's scratched inscription from the 16th year, telling us she was alive after all, still queen, right up near the end. There is one more thread to follow before we widen out, and it is the one that runs closest to the woman herself. Let us talk for a moment about the other wives, because Akhenaten did not have only Nefertiti. Egyptian kings very rarely did. There was a household, and in that household there was at least one other woman of real standing. A woman named Kia, who carried a title of her own, a title marking her as greatly beloved. She had her own sunshade, a kind of ritual structure, which was not a small thing to be granted. She appears with a daughter, and then, at some point, she is removed. Her name is hacked out. Her images are recut, altered, her titles overwritten, her monuments taken over and reassigned to others. Somebody in that court decided that Kia should cease to have existed and set about making it so. We do not know why. We do not know who ordered it. It is very tempting, and many people have found it irresistible, to imagine Nefertiti behind that erasure, a queen removing a rival, and there is a whole tradition of storytelling that has built exactly that picture. But there is no evidence for it. None. The erasure happened. The hand behind it is invisible, and it is worth saying plainly that we should resist the pull of that story, because it is the kind of story people have always liked to tell about powerful women, and liking a story is not the same as having grounds for it. What Kia's erasure does tell us, with certainty, is something colder and more useful, that in this court, at this time, a person could be unmade, names could be cut out of stone. A woman who had stood near the throne could be made to disappear. That was a thing they did. Remember it, because it is about to be done to all of them. And there is one more piece of this that we should hold, because it connects to the deepest question of the whole story. Somewhere in this household, a son was finally born. Not to Nefertiti as far as we can tell. The boy who would become Tutankhamun was born in these years, and the modern evidence which we will come to points away from Nefertiti as his mother and toward another woman of the royal house. So picture the position she was in as the years turned. She had given the king 6 daughters and no son. Another woman had given him a boy. And the boy was the future, because the throne passed through boys. Whatever else was happening in the private rooms of that palace, that fact was sitting in the middle of it, and it will not go away, and it presses on everything that comes after. So we arrive at the end of this long central passage, with a woman who is at once the most visible person in the ancient world and one of the least knowable, elevated beyond precedent, carved on every wall, crowned in a crown made for her alone, standing over a captive with a mace in her hand, mother of 6 girls, 3 of whom are dead before her eyes, wife to a king, who is remaking the world and letting an empire slip, surrounded by a household in which people could be erased. And then quietly, in a way we cannot reconstruct and cannot date and cannot explain, she stops. Now let us step back from her for a while and look at the world around her, the people and the pressures and the empire, because her story does not make sense on its own, and what happened to her cannot be understood apart from what was happening to everything else. So here we are, back in the desert city, the lamplight still on the painted walls, the sun disk still stretching its long ray hands down toward a family that is beginning to come apart. And now let us widen the view, because Nefertiti did not live in a private world. She lived at the center of a kingdom, surrounded by men and women whose choices shaped her life and whose fates were tangled with hers. To understand what happened to her, we have to understand them. Let us begin with her husband, because you cannot tell her story without telling his, and because he is one of the strangest figures ever to sit on a throne anywhere. Akhenaten came to power as Amenhotep IV, second son of a magnificent father, and he seems to have come to power almost by accident because an elder brother had died. He was not, in other words, raised from birth to be the king, and some scholars have wondered whether that accident of the succession matters, whether a man trained from infancy in the duties of the throne would ever have dared what he dared. And then, once he had the throne, he did something that no Egyptian king had ever done, and that very few rulers in all of history have ever done. He attacked the beliefs of his own people, not a foreign faith. His own, the temples his ancestors had built, the figures his ancestors had revered, the priesthoods his ancestors had endowed. He closed them, or emptied them, or simply starved them of the wealth that had kept them alive. And he replaced all of it with one thing, the disk of the sun, which the Egyptians called the Aten, understood now not as one power among many but as the single source of all life, reaching down its rays to the world. What did he actually believe? That is a question people have chewed on for a century and a half, and the answers say as much about the answerers as about him. Some have called him the first monotheist, the first person in recorded history to insist that there was only one power worth worshipping, and have found in that a kind of heroism, a lonely leap of the mind. Others have looked harder and pointed out that his belief may not have been monotheism at all in the strict sense. He did not necessarily deny that the other powers existed. He simply insisted that his household alone would worship the sun disk, and that everyone else must worship through him. Scholars use careful words for this, words like monolatry, the worship of one power without denying others. And still others have looked at the whole thing coldly and seen not faith but politics. A king who found himself facing an enormously wealthy, enormously entrenched priesthood, and who solved the problem by abolishing them, closed the temples, and the wealth comes back to the throne. Declare that the only access to the sacred runs through the royal family, and no priest can stand between the king and his people ever again. Which was it? Vision or calculation, or both at once, tangled so tightly together that even he could not have separated them? We cannot get inside his head, and we never will. And anyone who claims to have done so is telling you about themselves. What we can say is that the effect of the change, whatever its motive, was to concentrate every kind of power, sacred and political, into the hands of one family. And that is precisely where Nefertiti stood, in the middle of that concentration, not beside it and not beneath it. Inside those hands, one of the few through which all the power in Egypt now had to pass. There are hymns from Amarna, and one of them is very beautiful. It speaks of the sun rising and the world waking, the cattle stirring, the birds lifting from their nests, the fish leaping in the river, the child in the womb, the traveler on the road, all of it stirred into life by the light. It is one of the great pieces of religious poetry from the ancient world, and whoever composed it, whether the king himself or a poet in his service, had genuine gifts. There is a real tenderness toward the created world in it, and there is also, running underneath it, the same iron point. The light reaches the world, and the king knows the light, and no one else does. Now let us turn to a man who stands quietly at the edge of every scene in this story, and who may be the most important figure in it after the royal couple themselves. I was a courtier, and he was there from the beginning, and he was there at the end, and he was there after the end. He held titles of enormous weight, among them one that marked him as a fan-bearer at the king's right hand, which sounds decorative and was not. It meant proximity, and in a court, proximity is power. His wife Te had been nurse to Nefertiti. His tomb was cut at Amarna, among the great officials, and in it he and Te are shown receiving the favor of the king and the queen. He is very probably Nefertiti's father, though, as we have said, no text quite says so. And here is what makes him extraordinary. Every single person at the top of that court would fall. The king would die, the queen would vanish, the daughters would die or be married off into wreckage. The city would be abandoned, the belief would be smashed, and I would survive all of it. He would serve through the collapse. He would stand beside the boy Tutankhamun through his short reign. And when that boy died, still young, I would take the throne of Egypt himself and rule as king. Think about that arc. An old courtier, present at the beginning of the revolution, present at its end, present at the restoration, and finally in his old age, wearing the crown. Whatever else he was a supreme survivor. And men who survive courts like that are never passive. He was doing something through all those years. We simply cannot see what. And then there is the other side of the ledger, the man who came after, and who tried to erase all of them. Horemheb. Horemheb was a soldier, a general, a man of the army rather than the court, and when the dust of the Amarna period finally settled, he ended up on the throne, and he set about a program of destruction so thorough that it has shaped what we can and cannot know to this day. The temples Akhenaten had raised were pulled down. The blocks were carted off and used as rubble inside the walls and pylons of other buildings, which is, as it happens, why so many of them survive at all, hidden inside masonry for 3,000 years, waiting to be found when those later buildings were themselves taken apart. The names were hacked out, the king's monuments were defaced, and in the official lists of kings that later Egyptians drew up, the lists that told them who had ruled and in what order, Akhenaten simply is not there. Nor is his queen, nor are the strange figures who ruled in the years between. The years of Amarna were cut out of the record as if they had never happened, and the reigns on either side of the gap were stitched together to close the wound. They called him, in the very few places where he is mentioned at all in the centuries that followed, simply the enemy or the criminal, as though his name itself had become a thing too dangerous to write down. That is the memory Egypt kept of the king who had built the city in the desert. Not a name, but a curse, and it worked. That is the point that we must sit with, because it is not a small thing. It worked so well that for more than 3,000 years, nobody knew that Akhenaten had existed, or that Nefertiti had existed, or that a whole city had been raised and abandoned in the sand of Middle Egypt in a burst of religious fervor and then annihilated. The erasure was successful. What undid it was not memory, it was archaeology. Men digging in the ground 3 millennia later found the blocks inside the walls and the ruins under the sand and the tablets in the rubble, and put the story back together out of the debris of the destruction. And the reason we know Nefertiti's face today is that the thing that was supposed to destroy her, the abandonment of her city, is exactly what preserved it. Nobody built over Amarna. Nobody lived there again. It was left to the sand, and the sand kept it. There is a deep and quiet irony there, and it runs underneath everything else in this story, and we will return to it before the night is out, because it is, in the end, the thing that gives the whole tale its shape. Now, let us follow the wider story forward, past the point where Nefertiti disappears, because what happens next matters for understanding her. Akhenaten died, somewhere around the 17th year of his reign, and what follows is one of the murkiest passages in all of Egyptian history. A few years of confusion in which names appear and vanish, and nobody can agree on who was who. There is a figure called Smenkhkare, who seems to rule briefly, and who is shown with Merenptah Nefertiti's eldest daughter, as his great royal wife. There is a figure called Nefertiti, whose name is built out of the very words of Nefertiti's own longer name, and who appears to be female, and who seems to have ruled as a king. Are these two the same person? Are either of them Nefertiti? Is Smenkhkare a young man, a brother or son of Akhenaten, and Nefertiti a separate female ruler? Scholars have proposed every combination, and the evidence is thin enough to support several of them. What is reasonably clear is that in these few years, the whole structure came down. The empire's northern troubles did not fix themselves. The city in the desert, built for one man's belief, could not survive that man. And then a boy came to the throne. He was perhaps 8 or 9 years old. His name at first contained the name of the sun disk, Tutankhaten. And within a few years that name was changed, and the sun disk was taken out of it, and the old name was put back in, and he became Tutankhamen. That single change of name is the whole restoration in miniature. The court left Amarna, the old temples were reopened, the old priesthoods came back, and came back hungry. A great inscription was set up in the boy king's name, describing the land as it had been found. Temples fallen into ruin, sanctuaries overgrown, the sacred places abandoned, the land in disorder. And declaring that all of this was now being put right, the boy married Ankhesenaten, Nefertiti's third daughter, who changed her own name to Ankhesenamun in the same movement. So the restoration of Egypt was sealed by a marriage between a boy who was probably not Nefertiti's son and a girl who certainly was Nefertiti's daughter. Her blood carried on into the new order, even as her name was being chiseled off the walls. And then the boy died young, suddenly, after a reign of about a decade, and left no living heir. 2 tiny mummified infants were laid in his tomb, daughters who never drew breath. And his widow, Nefertiti's daughter, was left alone at the top of a kingdom, with no one to hold it. It is very probably her hand behind that desperate letter to a foreign king, asking for a son to marry, saying she has no one, saying she is afraid. A prince was sent, and he set out for Egypt, and he was killed somewhere on the road before he ever reached her. And whatever slender hope she had been holding died with him, out there in the dust, and she disappears from the record too. And then the old courtier A took the throne. And when I died, the general Horemheb took it, and Horemheb set about the erasure, and the family was gone, all of them, the king and the queen and the 6 daughters and the boy, and the old courtier, swept out of the record as though a hand had passed over a wet slate. Let us gather this, gently. Around Nefertiti stood a husband who broke the world he inherited, for reasons we still argue over. A courtier, very probably her father, who outlived them all and ended up wearing the crown. A general who came after and tried to unmake the memory of every one of them. 6 daughters, most of whom died young, one of whom carried the bloodline into the restoration, and then wrote a frightened letter to a foreign court and vanished. And behind all of it, an empire fraying, a plague perhaps moving through the cities, and a city in the desert with nobody left in it, the doors standing open, the sand starting to come in across the painted floors. Let us go back now and dwell more slowly on some of the people and pressures we passed over, because each of them deserves more than a sentence, and the night is long. Let us dwell on the empire, and on those clay tablets, because they are one of the most remarkable survivals from the ancient world, and they give us something we almost never get, the sound of ordinary panic. The tablets were found at Amarna itself, in what seems to have been an archive, and they are letters written in the international language of diplomacy of that age, on clay, in wedge-shaped script. Some are from the great kings of other lands, addressing the pharaoh as brother, arranging marriages, complaining about the quality of gifts, haggling over gold. Those letters are almost comic in places, the correspondence of enormously powerful men behaving like merchants. But others come from the small rulers of the cities in the lands to the north, the vassals who held their positions by Egyptian favor, and those letters are of a different character altogether. They are pleas. City after city writes to say that enemies are at the gates, that neighbors have turned traitor, that the lands of the pharaoh are being taken, that if troops are not sent the city will fall. Some write again and again, the tone rising each time. Some ask plainly why the king does not answer. Now, what do we make of this? The romantic version says, the king was lost in his sun disk, the queen was lost with him, and while they sang hymns to the light, the empire burned. It is a satisfying story, and it may even be partly true, but we should hold it loosely. Vassal rulers had every reason to exaggerate. A man asking for soldiers always says the situation is desperate. Egyptian control in those regions was always looser than the official rhetoric pretended. And there is evidence that Egypt did act, at least sometimes, in these years. So the picture is not simply of an empire abandoned. It is of an empire under strain, with a court whose attention was, at the very least, elsewhere. But the atmosphere is unmistakable, and atmosphere matters. Something in the letters feels like a house where the people upstairs have stopped coming down. And Nefertiti lived in that house. Let us dwell, too, on the priests and the wound that was done to them, because they are the great invisible actors in this drama. Think about what closing the temples actually meant, in practical terms, to real people. The temple of the figure they revered as Amun at Karnak was not only a place of worship, it was one of the largest economic institutions in the world. It held land, enormous quantities of it. It held granaries. It employed people, thousands of them, priests and scribes and farmers and weavers and brewers and bakers and craftsmen, whole populations whose livelihoods ran through that institution, and Akhenaten shut it. He took the revenues, he redirected the wealth. He told a great many powerful men that their positions no longer existed, and a great many ordinary people that the thing their grandparents had served was finished. You do not do that and make no enemies. And here is the point that matters for Nefertiti's story. Those enemies did not go away. They were still there, in the towns and the temples up and down the river, for 17 years, waiting. And the moment the king was dead, and the strange bright city had no one to hold it up, they came back. They came back fast. The restoration was not a slow drift. It was a wave, which tells us something about how deep the water had been all along, and how thin the ice. So when we ask why Nefertiti was erased, part of the answer is simply this. There were a great many people who wanted very much for all of it never to have happened, and when their moment came, they took it. Let us dwell for a while on Tutankhamun, because his story is bound tightly to hers, and because most people know his name and few people connect it back to her. He was a small boy when he came to the throne, and he was almost certainly not Nefertiti's son. The evidence points to another woman of the royal house as his mother, but he was raised in her city, in her world. His name at birth carried the sun disk in it. The first years of his childhood were spent inside the great experiment, and then it collapsed around him, and men in their 40s and 50s made decisions in his name. And by the age of perhaps 11 or 12, he was the instrument of the restoration. His name changed, his court moved, the old temples reopening, the old priesthoods flooding back into their halls. He married Nefertiti's daughter. They had no living children. 2 tiny bodies were laid in his tomb with him. He died young, and because his tomb was small and cramped and quickly overlooked, it survived nearly intact when every other royal tomb in that valley was stripped bare, and 3,000 years later it made him the most famous pharaoh who ever lived, though he ruled a decade and did very little. There is a symmetry there that is almost unbearable. The queen who was erased became the most famous face of the ancient world. The boy king who did almost nothing became the most famous name, both by accident, both because of what happened to survive. And let us dwell last on Horemheb and the shape of the erasure, because it is worth understanding exactly how it was done. It was not simply vandalism. It was administrative. The names were cut from the monuments, yes, but the years were also cut from the lists, and that is the deeper act. In the official records of the kings of Egypt, drawn up in later reigns, the succession runs from Amenhotep III straight on to the restoration, as if the intervening years had never been. Not condemned, not mentioned, removed, and when a scribe in a later century needed to refer to the period at all, the king of it was not named. He was called simply the enemy. That is what remained. Not a person, but a category. Now understand what that means for us, sitting here tonight. Every single thing we know about Nefertiti has been recovered against the intention of the people who controlled the record. We are reading a story that someone tried very hard to make unreadable. The blocks we study were found inside the guts of other buildings, hidden there as rubble. The city we walk through was found under sand because nobody bothered to reuse it. The face we love was found because a sculptor left it behind on a floor. Not one piece of it came down to us through the ordinary channels of memory. All of it was rescued from the wreckage of a deliberate forgetting. That is the wider story. That is the world that rose around her and then fell in on her. Let us dwell for a moment on the ordinary people of Amarna, because they are almost never mentioned, and they were the great majority. That city held perhaps 20 or 30,000 people, and most of them were not officials and not priests and not sculptors. They were laborers and haulers and water carriers and bakers and brickmakers. And archaeologists have dug their houses and, more tellingly, their cemeteries. And what those cemeteries show is not a golden age. The bodies, hard labor, spinal damage from carrying, injuries, poor nutrition, and a great many people who died young. This was a city thrown up at speed, in a place with no farmland worth speaking of, where everything had to be brought in, and the people who built it seemed to have paid for it in their bones. That is worth setting beside the painted scenes of the royal family under the sun disk, the tenderness, the children on their parents' laps, the long rays offering life. Both are true. The light reached the palace. Down in the workers' village, the light was something else. Let us dwell also on Ai a little longer, because the more you look at him, the stranger he becomes. Consider his position. If he was indeed Nefertiti's father, then he was the father of the most powerful queen in Egyptian history, and he watched her rise, and he watched her vanish, and he did not vanish with her. He served the heretic king. He served the boy who undid the heretic king. He stood beside that boy at every ceremony, an old man beside a child, and when the child died, he did not step aside for a soldier or a prince. He put the crown on his own head. There is a scene painted on the wall of Tutankhamun's own burial chamber, in which a figure in the dress of a king performs the last rite over the boy's mummy, the ritual that opened the mouth of the dead so that they might speak and eat in whatever came after. The figure performing it is named It Is I, so the old courtier is shown, in the tomb of the boy he had served, standing over his body as king, performing the rite that would carry him into the next world. Whatever you make of that image, it is not the image of a passive man. And when I himself died, the crown went to the general, and the general set about burying the whole family in silence, including, presumably, the memory of I himself, who was also chiseled out in his turn, his own monuments attacked, his name struck. So the survivor did not survive either, in the end. The erasure ate its own. There is a lesson in that, quiet and cold, and it is one the ancient world understood better than we do. Proximity to a throne is never safe. Not for the queen who is raised beside it, not for the courtier who serves it for 40 years, not for the daughter who is married into it. All of them ended in silence. Let us dwell before we go on the murky years that follow Akhenaten's death, because that is where Nefertiti's fate is hiding, and it is worth mapping the confusion carefully rather than skating over it. Here is the difficulty in plain terms. In the space of a very few years at the end of the Amarna period, we have more royal names than we have room for. There is Akhenaten, who dies in his 17th year. There is a figure called Smenkhkar, who appears to rule and who is shown with a great royal wife, and that wife is Meritaten, Nefertiti's eldest daughter. There is a figure called Neferuaten, whose name is built out of Nefertiti's own extended name, and who seems, from certain grammatical forms in the inscriptions, to have been female, and who ruled as a king. And then there is the boy, Tutankhaten, who becomes Tutankhamun. Now, how many people is that? It could be 4. It could be 3 if Smenkhkar and Neferuaten are the same person. It could be 3 in a different way if Neferuaten is Nefertiti under a new royal name. Some scholars have argued that Neferuaten is not Nefertiti at all but Meritaten, the daughter, ruling in her own right. Others have argued for a female pharaoh who is neither. The evidence is genuinely thin and genuinely contradictory. There are objects from Tutankhamun's tomb that appear to have been made originally for a ruler named Neferuaten, and then reused for the boy, which tells us that ruler died shortly before him and was important enough to be equipped like a king. There are epithets attached to that name which seem to speak of a woman, and one of them, in some readings, seems almost to plead, to speak of longing for a husband. And there is the co-regency stela, a damaged monument that seems to show 2 kings together and whose reading has been argued over for decades. What can we say honestly? We can say that a woman ruled Egypt as king in the last years of the Amarna period. That much now has broad support. We can say that this woman was, in all likelihood, either Nefertiti or one of her daughters. We cannot say which. And we can say that the quarry inscription, showing Nefertiti still holding the title of Great Royal Wife in the 16th year, makes the timeline very tight indeed. If she became a king, she did it in the last months of her husband's life or immediately after his death, and she did not hold the throne for long. So the wider story ends not in an answer but in a knot of names in a handful of years at the collapse of everything, and somewhere inside that knot is a woman, and we cannot get her out. Now let us turn to the evidence itself, to the things we can actually hold in our hands, and see what they can and cannot tell us. So let us come now to the evidence, not the story, but the things. The stones, the scans, the bones, the tests, because everything we have said tonight rests on physical objects that were dug out of the ground, and it is worth looking at those objects closely, and at the people who found them, and at the arguments that have raged over them ever since. And we must begin where the modern story of Nefertiti begins, on a December day a little over a century ago, in the ruins of the abandoned city. A German expedition was digging at Amarna, led by an archaeologist named Ludwig Borchardt. They were working through the ruins of a house that had belonged, the inscriptions told them, to a sculptor. His name was Tutmose, and he had been, it seems, a master of his craft and a man of high standing, and when the city was abandoned he had walked away and left his workshop behind, with his work still in it. Into that buried workshop the diggers went, And in the sandy rubble on the floor, lying face down, they found a painted limestone head of a woman. It was almost perfectly preserved. The paint was still on it. The long neck, the level gaze, the tall blue crown, the faint red still on the lips. One eye was inlaid. The other was empty. It had lain there in the dark for something like 33 centuries, face down, a few inches under the floor of a ruined house in an abandoned city that no one had lived in since the age of the pharaohs, while empires rose and fell above it, and the whole world forgot that the woman whose face it wore had ever drawn breath. Borchardt, it is said, wrote in his diary that evening something to the effect that describing it was useless, that words would not serve. You had to see it with your own eyes. It is a rare thing in the dry records of an excavation to catch a man being knocked sideways, and he had been. The bust went to Berlin under an arrangement by which fines were divided between the excavators and Egypt. It sat for years in a private house before it was ever put on public display, and when at last it was shown to the world, it detonated. There had never been anything like it. Here was a face from the deepest antiquity that did not look ancient at all, that looked like a living woman, poised and composed and startlingly modern in her calm. Within a few years, in the great wave of Egyptomania that followed the discovery of the boy king's tomb, that face became one of the most reproduced images on earth, and the arguments began, and they have never stopped. There has been a long and bitter dispute about whether the bust should ever have left Egypt at all, and Egypt has asked for it back, more than once, and it remains in Berlin. That argument is not one we will settle tonight, and there are strong feelings on both sides, and it is right that people should feel strongly about it. But there is a stranger question about the bust, and it is this: what was it for? It was found in a sculptor's workshop, not in a temple and not in a tomb, and the leading view is that it was never meant to be seen at all, that it was a model, a master study kept in the studio, so that other artists could copy the Queen's features correctly onto the statues and reliefs that the state required. Which means that this face, the most famous face of the ancient world, may be in effect a workshop reference object, a tool. And then there is the eye. The left eye of the bust is empty, and people have built a great deal on that emptiness. It has been said that the Queen was blind in one eye, that she suffered some disease, that the missing eye is a symbol of something. The likelier answer is much duller and much more interesting. The eye was never put in. It was simply never finished, and it never was going to be. There is no trace of adhesive in the socket, no sign that an inlay was ever fitted and then lost, which fits the model theory rather well. An unfinished master study, kept on a shelf, one eye left unmade, because the sculptor had already recorded what he needed to record. And then, some years ago, they put the bust into a scanner, and the scan showed something no one had expected. Beneath the smooth outer layer of painted plaster, there is a carved limestone core, and the face on that inner core is not the same face. It is a little more human. There are creases at the corners of the mouth. There is a bump on the nose. There are hollows in the cheeks. Someone carved a real woman with a real face, and then someone, perhaps the same man, laid plaster over her and smoothed the creases away and straightened the nose and made her perfect. Sit with that for a moment, because it is one of the most quietly astonishing facts in this whole story. The most famous face in the ancient world is a face that was idealized on purpose, and the real one is still in there, underneath, and we can see it. Now let us turn to the harder evidence, the bodies. Because the question that hangs over everything is simple. Where is she? The hunt has centered for a long time on a tomb in the Valley of the Kings called, in the modern system, Tomb 35, which was found at the very end of the 19th century by a French archaeologist named Victor Loret. It had originally been made for a king of an earlier generation, but it had later been used as a hiding place, a cache, where priests of a later age had stashed royal mummies that they were trying to protect from robbers. And in a side chamber of that tomb lay 3 unwrapped bodies side by side, an older woman, a younger woman, and a boy. The younger woman became known simply as the younger lady, and for a while there was real excitement, because here was an unidentified royal woman of roughly the right period, and the temptation to see Nefertiti in her was very strong. In the early years of this century, a British Egyptologist argued the case publicly and forcefully. The double-pierced ear, the shaven head, the mark on the brow where a tight royal band had pressed, all of it, she argued, pointed to Nefertiti. It was announced on television. It caused an enormous row, both scholarly and political, a row that ran through the newspapers and the universities alike, and the researcher was for a time barred from working in Egypt at all. And then the genetic testing came and it took the whole thing apart. The numbers are striking, and they are worth laying out plainly. Testing of the royal mummies of this period indicated that the younger lady was the mother of Tutankhamun. It also indicated that she was herself a daughter of the great king Amenhotep III and his queen Ti, which is to say, a sister of Akhenaten. And Nefertiti, on all the evidence we have, was not a daughter of that king and that queen. Nefertiti was almost certainly not a royal princess at all, but the daughter of a courtier. So the younger lady, if the testing holds, is not Nefertiti. She is another woman entirely, a sister of the king, and the mother of the boy, who would restore the old belief. The testing has been challenged, as such testing often is. Ancient genetic material is fragile. Contamination is a genuine hazard, and some scholars have raised real questions about the sampling and the conclusions. Others have proposed different reconstructions of the family tree entirely, and the debate is live. But the mainstream position at present is that the younger lady is not the queen we are looking for. Which brings us to the other great modern hunt, and it is the one that has produced more headlines than anything else in Egyptology in recent decades. Some years ago, an English Egyptologist named Nicholas Reeves was studying very high-resolution laser scans of the walls of Tutankhamun's tomb, the small, cramped, famously overstuffed tomb in the Valley of the Kings. And looking at those scans, at the faint topography under the painted plaster, he thought he saw straight lines, ghosts of edges. The outlines, he suggested, of doorways that had been blocked up and plastered over and painted across, and from that he built a theory that electrified the world. Tutankhamun's tomb, he argued, is oddly small for a king and oddly shaped, and it turns to the right, which is a pattern more typical of the burial of a queen. What if the tomb was not built for the boy at all? What if it was originally cut as the burial of someone else, someone who had died shortly before him, and the boy, dying young and suddenly, was hurried into the outer part of an existing tomb, because there was nowhere else to put him? And what if the person for whom that tomb was made was still lying, sealed, behind the painted north wall? What if Nefertiti was on the other side of the wall, a few feet away, and had been all along, while millions of visitors filed past? It is one of the great modern archaeological hypotheses, and the beauty of it is that, unlike most speculation about the ancient world, it was testable, and so they tested it. They brought in ground-penetrating radar, and the first survey came back and seemed to show something. Voids, spaces, anomalies behind the walls. There was tremendous excitement. And then a second survey was done, by a different team, and it found nothing. And then a third. And the results have gone back and forth, survey after survey, team after team, with some readings suggesting a corridor-like space in the vicinity, and others flatly contradicting them. At the time of this telling, no hidden chamber behind the wall of that tomb has been demonstrated, and the mainstream view has cooled considerably. The theory remains unproven. It has not been definitively killed, but it has certainly not been confirmed. And this brings us to something worth saying plainly, in the calm of the night. Nefertiti attracts announcements. Her tomb has been found in the newspapers more than once. Bodies have been identified as hers and unidentified again. There is a whole rhythm to it, a cycle of headline and retraction that has been running for decades, and it happens because her name sells, and because certainty sells better than doubt. The responsible position, the one held by most serious Egyptologists, is simply this: we do not know where Nefertiti is buried. We have never found her body. We have never found her tomb. And every claim to the contrary has so far failed to hold up. And now let us deal, briefly and firmly, with the fringe. Ancient Egypt attracts a great deal of nonsense, and the Amarna period attracts more than its share, because it is strange, and because the record is broken, and because broken records are where people love to insert their own inventions. So you will find, if you go looking, claims that Akhenaten and Nefertiti were not human at all, that they were visitors from elsewhere, that the elongated skulls in the Amarna art are evidence of some other species, that the whole episode was contact with something not of this world. Let us be clear, there is no evidence for any of it. The distinctive body shapes in Amarna art, the long skulls, the heavy hips, the strange elongated features, are found in images of everyone in the royal circle, including people we have no reason to think were physically unusual, which points strongly toward an artistic style, a deliberate visual language, rather than a literal record of anatomy. And the one royal body of this family that we can examine, the boy king, is anatomically an ordinary human being with an ordinary human skull. And it is worth saying why the fringe is not merely wrong, but wasteful. Because the real story here is more extraordinary than the invented one. A king who tried to overturn the beliefs of an entire civilization. A queen raised to a height no woman had held. A city built from nothing in a desert and abandoned within a generation. A family erased so thoroughly that the world forgot them for 3,000 years. A painted head lying, face down, in the sand of a ruined workshop until a man's hand closed around it. You do not need to invent anything. The truth here is stranger than any fiction anyone has managed to invent about it, and it has the considerable additional advantage of being true. And finally, the reminder that we should carry out of this section, and it is a hopeful one. Egypt is not finished. Amarna itself has been excavated for well over a century and is still yielding. Only a fraction of the ancient world has been dug, and the ground keeps giving things up. The quarry inscription that overturned the dating of Nefertiti's disappearance was found only a few years ago, scratched on a rock face where it had sat, unread, since a workman put it there. Somewhere out there in the sand, in a cliff, under a village, under a field, there may be a chamber with a coffin in it and a name on the coffin. Nobody can promise it, but nobody can rule it out either. And that is why people keep looking, year after year, season after season, out in the heat with their brushes and their sieves and their scanners. Because Egypt has surprised them before, and it will surprise them again. Let us go back now and dwell more slowly on several of these things, because each of them repays a longer look. Let us go back first to the hidden chamber theory, because it deserves a fair and full hearing, and because it is a beautiful piece of reasoning even if it turns out to be wrong. The argument runs like this. The tomb of Tutankhamun is peculiar. It is very small for a king. Its layout is unusual, and it turns in a direction that in that valley tends to be associated with the burials of royal women rather than kings. The decoration is limited and looks rushed, and the objects inside it are, in a surprising number of cases, second-hand. Things made for somebody else and then adapted, names overwritten, cartouches recut. Among those adapted objects are pieces that seem originally to have carried the name of the female ruler Nefertiti. So put those observations together. A king dies unexpectedly young. There is no tomb ready for him, because nobody expected to need one. But there is a tomb, recently used, belonging to a ruler who died a very short time before him. So they open it, they push the earlier burial into an inner chamber, or leave it where it lies, they wall it off, they plaster over the wall, they paint the plaster, and they lay the boy in the outer rooms with whatever grave goods they can gather in 70 days, including things that had been made for the previous occupant. If that is what happened, then the previous occupant is still there. And if the previous occupant is Nefertiti, and if Nefertiti is Nefertiti, then the most sought-after burial in the history of Egyptology has been sitting a few feet behind a painted wall, in the most visited tomb on Earth since the day it was found. You can see why it caused a sensation, and you can see why it had to be tested, and why the testing has been so fraught. Radar through limestone is not a simple business. The rock is not uniform, there are cracks and fills, and the readings are difficult to interpret, and different teams with different equipment have come back with different answers. Some scans suggested a void, others found nothing. The most recent work has tended to cool the idea rather than support it, though some researchers still argue there is a corridor-like space in the general area, perhaps unconnected to the tomb at all. Where does that leave us? It leaves us with a hypothesis that is elegant, testable, unproven, and not yet dead. That is an uncomfortable place for a story to sit, but it is where the evidence actually is, and we should sit there honestly rather than pretending to a certainty nobody has. Let us go back to Amarna itself, to the site, because it is one of the most remarkable archaeological places on Earth and most people have never heard of it. Understand what it is. Almost every other great Egyptian city was lived in continuously for thousands of years. People built on top of the old buildings, and then on top of those, and the ancient layers were dug into and robbed and cut through and buried under later towns that are often still there today, which is why so much of ancient Egypt is unreachable, under modern streets. But Amarna was occupied for a single generation and then abandoned. Nobody came back. There was no reason to. It was the capital of a discredited belief in a place with no natural advantages. And so it sat there, in its say of desert, for 3,000 years, essentially undisturbed except by robbers and by wind. What that means is that Amarna is a snapshot. One moment of Egyptian life frozen, not the accumulated jumble of centuries but a single decade, laid out flat, with its palaces and its temples and its workshops and its slums and its rubbish heaps and its cemeteries, all belonging to the same brief span. There is nowhere else like it. And it is why we know as much as we do about how people actually lived in ancient Egypt, because at Amarna we can walk into an ordinary house and know when it was lived in, almost to the year. Excavation there has now been going on, in fits and starts, for well over a century. And it keeps giving. The workers' cemeteries were only excavated in recent decades, and they changed how scholars think about the human cost of the whole project. The rubbish heaps have given up the diplomatic tablets. The workshops have given up sculpture. And nobody, not one archaeologist working there, believes the site is finished. Let us go back, too, to the sculptor's workshop, because there was more in it than the famous head. Thutmose's studio yielded a whole group of pieces: unfinished heads, plaster casts, studies in stone, faces of the royal family and of other people whose names we do not know. There are plaster faces that appear to have been taken from life or from death. Extraordinary things. The features of people who lived 33 centuries ago, captured in soft material and hardened. There are heads of the daughters. There is a head of the king, and there is, among them, another study of Nefertiti, an unfinished one in brown quartzite, which some people find even more moving than the famous bust, because it is not finished and not idealized and not painted, and the face in it is quieter, older, more tired, and somehow more like a person. Put the two side by side and you get the whole problem of knowing her in a single glance. The painted one is perfect and unreachable. The unfinished one is human and incomplete. And we cannot say which is closer to the woman who actually lived. Let us go back as well to the question of the mummies, because there is more to say, and it matters. The mummies of this whole family are a mess, and it is worth understanding why. Royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings were robbed, extensively in antiquity. And so, in a later age, priests gathered up what remained of the royal dead, rewrapped them, moved them, hid them in caches, sometimes stripped them of what was left, sometimes put them in the wrong coffins, sometimes labeled them, and sometimes not. The bodies that we have from this period have been moved, unwrapped, reburied, and handled repeatedly across 3,000 years. Then there is the body from the tomb known as 55, a strange and battered burial with a defaced coffin and hacked-out names, containing a male body that many scholars believe to be Akhenaten himself, though even that is contested. If it is him, then we have the heretic king, and his bones are unremarkable. An ordinary man, no elongated skull, no monstrous deformity, nothing to support the wilder stories. And then there is the great absence, Nefertiti, no coffin, no body, no canopic equipment we can be sure of. Nothing but a few fragments of small funerary figures bearing her name, which suggest a burial was prepared, and which tell us nothing at all about where it went. And on the genetic testing, one honest note: it has given us a family tree, and the tree it gives has consequences. It makes Nefertiti almost certainly not the mother of Tutankhamun, and it makes the younger lady almost certainly not Nefertiti. But it is worth being clear that this work has been criticized by serious specialists, that ancient genetic material degrades, that contamination is a permanent risk, and that the sample sizes are tiny. The mainstream accepts the broad results. A minority does not. That is where things stand, and it would be dishonest to pretend the matter is closed with the finality that a television documentary might suggest. And one last piece of evidence, small and easily missed, but worth holding as we leave this section. That quarry inscription, the one from the 16th year that put Nefertiti back into the last years of the reign, was not found by a great expedition or announced with fanfare. It was noticed. Someone was looking carefully at a rock face in an old limestone quarry a little way north of the abandoned city, a place people had walked past for a century, and read what was written there, and realized what it said. Think about how many things had to happen for that to reach us. A workman had to scratch a note into a rock, for reasons of his own, thousands of years ago. The rock had to survive. The quarry had to not be destroyed. The inscription had to escape the chisels of the men who were erasing her name everywhere else. And it did. Presumably because it was too small and too obscure and too far out in the desert for anyone to bother with. And then, 3,300 years later, a person had to walk past and look up and see it. And that scratch overturned a scholarly consensus that had stood for generations. That is what the evidence for Nefertiti is like. It is not a library. It is a handful of things that happened, by pure chance, to escape a deliberate destruction. A head left on a workshop floor. A block hidden inside a wall as rubble, a note scratched in a quarry, a rubbish heap full of clay letters. Everything we know because the erasers missed something. Now let us step back from the digging and the scanning, and think in the quiet about what all of this means. So we have followed her, as far as the evidence allows, from an unknown birth, through an unprecedented rise, into the strange bright city in the desert, through the deaths of her children, to the silence that swallows her. And now in the deep quiet of the night, let us sit with what it all means. Consider, first, the erasure and what it tried to do. The men who came after set out deliberately and systematically to make Nefertiti and her husband cease to have existed. This was not carelessness. This was policy. Chisels were taken to her name. Her husband's temples were pulled down and the stones reused as fill. Their years were cut out of the official lists so that the kings before and after were joined together across a gap where they had been. This is not science fiction. This is a documented program of official forgetting, carried out by a state that had the power to do it and the will to see it through. And it very nearly worked, completely, more completely than almost any erasure in the whole of recorded history. For more than 3,000 years, the world did not know her name. And now consider what actually happened. Let that sink in for a moment. Of all the queens of Egypt, of the hundreds of royal women who lived and died along that river across 3,000 years of pharaohs, whose names were carved in temples and never erased, whose tombs were built and furnished and sealed with every honor, which one does the world know? Whose face is on the postcards, on the posters, in the museums, in the mind of nearly every person on earth who could not name a single other Egyptian queen? It is, of all of them, the one they tried hardest to delete. There is something in that which is almost too neat to be believed, and yet it is simply what happened. The erasure failed, and it failed in a way its authors could never have imagined, because the very act of abandoning her city, of walking away from Amarna and leaving it to the sand rather than building over it, is what preserved the sculptor's workshop with her face still lying in it. They buried her, and the burial kept her. Had Amarna remained a living city, occupied and rebuilt for 3,000 years like Thebes or Memphis, that painted head would almost certainly have been ground to dust long ago. It survived because the place was abandoned. It survived because of the very hatred that was meant to end her. Consider, next, what it means that we know her face and not her voice. We have thousands of images of Nefertiti. We have her carved on temple walls, on tomb walls, on stelae, on blocks, in painted plaster. We have her crowned, worshipping, driving, mourning, holding her children, raising a mace. And we do not have a single word from her, not a letter, not a recorded sentence, not one report of anything she ever said. The most seen woman in the ancient world is entirely silent. And so the temptation which almost everybody gives in to is to put words in her mouth. She becomes whatever the age needs her to be. In one era, she is the devoted wife. In another, she is the power behind the throne, the true architect of the revolution. In another, she is a ruthless dynast, removing rivals. In another, she is a feminist icon, a woman who seized a throne. In another, she is a victim, a mother destroyed by grief. All of these portraits have been painted, seriously and at length, and every one of them uses the same evidence, and the evidence sits there and says nothing. That, I think, is the deepest thing this story has to teach, and it is worth carrying carefully. The past does not always answer. Sometimes it hands you a face and withholds everything else, and the honest response is not to invent a voice, but to sit with the silence and admit what it is. There is a discipline in that, and a kind of respect, and it is harder than it sounds, because the silence is uncomfortable and the temptation to fill it is very strong. Consider, too, the fragility of it all. Here was the richest, most powerful kingdom on earth. Here was a family at the very summit of that kingdom, with the wealth of the world flowing to their door, carving their names into stone precisely so that those names would last forever, because that was what stone was for. And within a generation of their deaths, the city was empty. The temples were rubble. The names were chiseled out, and the daughters were dead or scattered. It took 1,000 years to build the world they inherited, and less than 20 years to break it, and less than 20 more to break the breaking. Nothing they built survived in the way they intended. The city died, the belief died, the dynasty died, and yet something survived, and it survived by accident. A plasterhead on a workshop floor, a scratch on a quarry wall, some clay tablets in a rubbish heap, a boy king's tomb overlooked by robbers because it was too small and too poor, and lay under the debris of a grander tomb above it. Everything they meant to last perished. Everything that lasted, they never meant to leave behind at all. That is not immoral. It is simply what happened, and it happens more often than we like to think. And consider, finally, the woman herself beneath the crown. Because underneath the theology and the politics and the arguments, there is a person here, and we should not lose her. A young woman, married very young, to a man with an extraordinary and possibly frightening vision. A woman who bore 6 children and buried at least 3 of them, and who was carved in her grief, on the wall of a tomb, bowed over the body of her dead daughter, in an image so raw that Egyptian art had no precedent for it. A woman who was raised higher than any queen before her, and who was, at the end, either dead or crowned or set aside, and we cannot say which. And a woman whose real face, the one with the lines at the mouth and the bump on the nose, is still there, under the plaster, in Berlin. Not the perfect one. The other one, the one with the lines and the tiredness in it. The one the sculptor actually saw, sitting in front of him, before he took up his plaster and smoothed her into something that would last. Let that sink in as you drift. Under the most idealized face in the history of the world, there is a real woman's face, and it was there all along, and nobody knew until the machines could look through the surface. That is Nefertiti's whole story in miniature. There is always something underneath, and we are still learning how to see it. Consider, next, what it means to be a woman in that position, in that world, and how carefully we have to think about it. It is very tempting, and it has become very common, to make Nefertiti a symbol, a woman who seized power in a world of men, a queen who became a king, a feminist icon reaching back across 3,000 years. And there is something in that. The images really do show her doing things no woman had been shown doing, and if she did rule as a king, then she stands in a very short line of women who held the throne of Egypt in their own right. But let us be careful, because the symbol can eat the person. Nefertiti did not live in our world and did not think our thoughts. Whatever she was doing, she was not doing it for the reasons we would do it. She was operating inside a system of belief we can barely reconstruct. In a court where a woman could be erased from the record by a stroke of a chisel, married very young to a man who held absolute power, in a family where the children were dying one after another. To flatten that into a slogan is to lose almost everything that is actually interesting about her. And here is the deeper trouble. We do not know that she seized anything. We do not know that she wanted power. We know that she was raised in images to an extraordinary height. We do not know by whom or at whose wish, or whether she welcomed it or whether she had any say in it at all. The most honest thing we can say about the most famous woman of the ancient world is that we cannot tell whether she was an agent or an instrument. And that uncertainty is not a failure of scholarship. It is simply the truth of the evidence, and we have to be able to sit in it. Consider, too, what her story says about power, and about the peculiar danger of standing near a throne. Every person in this story who stood close to the crown was destroyed by it. The king died and was cursed. The queen vanished. The daughters died young or were married into the wreckage and disappeared. The old courtier climbed all the way to the throne itself and was erased in his turn. The boy king died at an age when most people are only beginning, and his tomb survived only because it was too small to be worth robbing properly. Not one of them ended well, not one. And they had everything. They had the wealth of the world coming to their door in tribute. They had absolute authority over the greatest kingdom on earth. They had artists and architects and armies and priests. They had the ability, literally, to move a capital city on a whim, and they used it. And none of it saved a single one of them, and none of it saved their children, and none of it even secured them the one thing they most cared about, which was to be remembered. That is worth carrying with you, quietly. The pyramids were built to make their owners remembered, and we remember them. Amarna was built to make a family remembered, and the family was deliberately forgotten within a generation. Power builds monuments. It cannot make them mean what you wanted them to mean once you are no longer there to insist. Consider as well the strangeness of loving a stranger's face, because that is what has happened, on an enormous scale, with Nefertiti. Millions of people feel that they know her. Her face is on posters and mugs and book covers and museum walls. She has become a byword for beauty, for elegance, for a certain unruffled composure. People have named their daughters after her. And the woman herself is almost entirely unknown to us, and the face they love is, we now know, an idealized surface laid over a more ordinary one, made by a craftsman as a working model, probably never intended for any eye but his own, and the eyes of the men who copied from it. There is nothing wrong with that. We are allowed to be moved by a beautiful object, but it is worth being clear-eyed about what it is we are moved by. We are not moved by Nefertiti. We are moved by a sculptor's idea of Nefertiti, made 33 centuries ago, by a man whose own name we would not know if he had not written it on a piece of ivory that happened to survive in his own rubble. And in a way, that is fitting. Everything about her comes to us at one remove. The images made by her husband's artist to make a theological point, the crowns designed to make a political statement, the plaster smoothed over the limestone to make a perfect face out of a real one. Layer over layer over layer, and somewhere at the bottom a woman we cannot reach. Consider at the last the daughters, because they are the part of this that stays with me. 6 girls. We know their names. We can see them carved on walls, climbing on their parents, being kissed, being held. We can see their mother and father bowed in grief over one of them. And of the 6, not one has a known grave, not one body has been securely identified. They are simply gone, all of them, out of a family so powerful that it could raise a city out of empty sand, and so thoroughly destroyed that it could not keep its own children's bones. And yet, here we are, 3,300 years later, in the middle of the night, in a world they could not have imagined, and we are saying their names out loud. Meritaten, Meketaten, Anchisenpaten. That is not nothing. It may even be the only kind of afterlife that any of us actually get. To be spoken of, once in a while, by someone who never knew us, long after everyone who did is gone. And consider one more thing, before we let it all go. What it means that the story is unfinished. Most of the stories we tell about the ancient world are closed. The king reigned, the king died, the king was buried here, and here is his tomb, and here are his bones. Nefertiti's is not closed, it is still open. There is, at this moment, somewhere in Egypt, either a chamber with her in it, or the dust of a chamber that was emptied long ago, and we do not know which, and it is possible, genuinely possible, that within our lifetimes someone will find out. That is a rare thing, and it is worth appreciating. Very few of the great questions about the ancient world are still live. Most have been settled, or have been shown to be unanswerable. This one is neither. It hangs there, waiting, and every few years someone points a machine at a wall and the whole world holds its breath for a moment. And whether they find her or not, the story does not really change. Because the astonishing thing about Nefertiti was never going to be her bones. The astonishing thing is what she survived. A chisel taken to her name, a city buried in sand, 3,000 years of silence, a deliberate, organized, state-sponsored campaign to make her never have been. And she came through all of it, on the strength of a single unfinished head that a craftsman left behind on a shelf when he walked out of his workshop for the last time and closed the door. Now let us come gently to the close. And so we come to the end of our long night together, the story of Nefertiti, the beautiful one who came. Let us draw it slowly to a close now, softly, without hurry, letting it all settle the way the silt settles on the fields when the flood is past and the water has gone still. Picture it one last time, the great river running north through the desert, as it ran then, as it runs tonight, the black earth on either side of it, and the red desert beyond. And in the middle of Egypt, on the east bank, a wide bay of empty ground held in a great half-circle of cliffs. And on that ground, rising out of nothing in the space of a decade, a city. White walls, open temples with their courts full of offering tables laid out under the sky, painted floors with marshes and birds on them. A great straight road down the middle where every morning a king and a queen drove out in their chariots into the light. Picture her there. The tall blue crown, flat across the top that belonged to no one else, the long neck, the level unhurried gaze, her 6 daughters around her, the sun disk above and the long rays coming down, and each ray ending in a small human hand, and the hands holding out the sign of life to her and to her husband and to no one else in all the world. Picture the deaths coming, the second daughter gone, and the scene of mourning cut into the rock of the tomb, a mother and a father bent over a child's body in a posture no Egyptian artist had ever been permitted to carve. The other daughters slipping quietly out of the record, one after another, into a silence that never lifts, and the empire outside writing letters that nobody answers, and the sickness perhaps moving through the towns, and the great bright confidence of the 12th year draining away year by year. And picture her at the end, whatever the end was. Still queen in the 16th year, we know that now, from a scratch on a quarry wall left by a working man who never dreamed anyone would read it. And then, after that, nothing. Perhaps death. Perhaps a crown and a throne and a reign of her own under another name, brief and doomed. Perhaps something we have not yet thought of. The record simply stops and closes over her and does not open again. Picture the city emptying, the court packing up and going back to the old places, the doors left standing open. the sand beginning to blow in across those painted floors, across the marshes and the birds, covering them slowly, year by year, until there was nothing to see but a low mound in the desert and a scatter of stone. And picture, in one of those abandoned houses, in the workshop of a sculptor named Thutmose, standing on a shelf or lying on a bench among his tools, a painted head that he did not take with him when he closed the door and walked away for the last time. And picture it falling at some point, in some year nobody recorded, and lying face down in the rubble on the floor, and the sand coming in over it, and the centuries going by above it, 3,000 years of them, the empires rising and falling far away, the river flooding and falling, and the head lying there in the dark under the floor of a ruined house in an abandoned city, with the paint still on the lips, and then a hand reaching down into the rubble and lifting it out into the light. That is the story of Nefertiti, a woman who came from we know not where, who rose higher than any queen of Egypt had ever risen, who stood at the center of the strangest experiment the ancient world ever attempted, who bore 6 daughters and buried her children, who was raised in stone to the very edge of kingship, and who then vanished so completely that we cannot say how she died, or when, or where she lies. A woman whose enemies tried, with chisels and hammers and the full power of a state, to make her cease to have existed, and who is now, 3,300 years later, the most recognizable woman of the entire ancient world. Let us go over it once more, slowly and softly, the way you might turn over a smooth stone in your hand before setting it down. A girl was born, somewhere in Egypt, in a year nobody wrote down, to parents whose names we can only guess at. She was given a name that meant the beautiful one has come, and she married a young prince who would become a king, and who would then do something no ruler of Egypt had ever done: turn against the beliefs of his own ancestors, close the ancient temples, and declare that the light of the sun disk alone gave life to the world. And she stood beside him while he did it, not behind him, beside him, and in the images they made, she was raised higher and higher, to his own scale, into his own crowns, into a crown of her own that no one else has ever worn, into a chariot, into rites that only kings performed, and at last into the oldest and most sacred pose in all of Egyptian art, standing over a captive with a mace lifted in her hand. They built a city in the empty desert to hold their new belief. It rose in a decade out of nothing, white and open, with temples that had no roofs because the light was meant to fall directly on the altars. She rode down its great road in the mornings, in the sun, with her daughters around her. 6 daughters, no sons. And then the deaths began. A child gone, and the grief carved into the rock of a tomb in a way that Egyptian artists had never been allowed to carve grief before. Then another child, and another, dropping quietly out of the record with no explanation, only silence, and an empire outside writing letters that no one answered, and a queen who, somewhere in those darkening years, stops appearing on the walls. She was alive in the 16th year. We know that now because of a note scratched on a quarry wall by a working man who never imagined anyone would read it. After that, nothing at all. Death, or a throne, or something we have not thought of. The record closes and does not reopen, and then they came with their chisels, and they cut her name out of the stone, and pulled down her husband's temples, and buried the blocks in the walls of other buildings, and struck the years out of the lists of kings, so that the reigns on either side of the gap were sewn together, and the gap was gone, and the city emptied, and the doors stood open, and the sand came in. And for 3,300 years, nobody knew. And then a hand reached into the rubble of a sculptor's ruined workshop, and lifted out a painted head, and turned it over and saw a face. That is the story. Let it settle now. Let the arguments go, the theories, the scans, the disputes about who is buried where. They will still be there tomorrow, and the scholars will still be arguing, and perhaps one day the sand will give up an answer, and perhaps it never will. None of that matters tonight. Tonight, let there just be the image, the river, the cliffs, the open temples full of light, the queen in her tall blue crown, and the long rays of the sun coming down with their small human hands, offering life. She has been silent for 3,000 years, and she will be silent tomorrow, but she is not gone. That is the thing to carry down into sleep. They did everything they could to erase her, and they failed, and the proof of their failure is that you know her face. You knew it before tonight, before you ever heard her story, before you knew a single thing about the city in the desert, or the sun disk, or the 6 daughters. Almost everyone does. That is how completely they failed. The beautiful one came. That is what her name says, and it has been saying it for 3,300 years. on stone and on plaster, and in the mouths of people who never knew her. The beautiful one came, and she has not in the end gone away. Think, as the night deepens, of how long ago all of this was, 3,300 years. The floods rising and falling on the fields, over and over thousands of times. The sun coming up over those eastern cliffs every single morning since, on an empty city, on a mound of rubble, on a stretch of sand, where a queen once drove a chariot in the light. All the empires of the world rising and falling somewhere far away while that head lay face down in the dark, under a workshop floor, waiting with the paint still on its lips. Such depths of time are hard to hold in the mind, and there is a strange peace in them if you let there be. Everything that was urgent has stopped being urgent. Everything that was a crisis is over. The priests who hated her, the general who erased her, the courtier who outlived her, the enemies at the northern border, the letters that went unanswered, the quarrels in the palace, all of it settled long ago into silence, and the river went on flowing, as it flows tonight, north through the desert to the sea, and that is a good thing to rest with, in the deep part of the night, that the great troubles pass, that the shouting stops, that whatever seemed enormous and unbearable in its moment becomes, in the end, a quiet story that someone tells gently to help another person fall asleep, 3,000 years later, in a language that did not exist when it happened. Let the images stay with you as you drift soft and dim, the way the last light stays in a room after the lamp is out. The tall blue crown, the long neck and the level gaze. The white city in its bay of desert, the cliffs standing back around it in a great half circle. The open courts full of offering tables, hundreds of them in their rows, and the light coming straight down onto all of them at once. The chariot on the great road in the morning. The 6 girls. The long rays of the sun reaching down, each one ending in a small human hand, holding out life. And the painted head, lying face down in the sand under a ruined floor, in the dark for 33 centuries, with the red still on the lips, waiting. She has been resting a very long time, wherever she is, and now it is your turn. Let the river carry you now, gently, as it carried the boats of Egypt, under the same stars that stood over that desert city on the night the last people walked out of it and left the doors open behind them. Let the sand settle, softly, the way it settled over that city. Let the lamplight fade, the way it faded in the sculptor's workshop on the last evening anybody worked there. The story is told now, the whole of it, and the night is deep and dark and quiet around you, and there is nothing left to do, and nothing left to hold on to, and nothing left but to rest. Sleep well.